I'm delighted to be able to introduce our next speaker, Stephen Fox, who's a friend of mine as well. And we've had a number of architectural adventures together. Stephen is an architectural historian and a lecturer at the Rice School of Architecture. He's also a lecturer at the Gerald D. Hines College of Architecture at the University of Houston and a fellow of the Anchorage Foundation of Texas. Fox's work is focused on architecture of the 19th and 20th century, especially the architecture of Houston and Texas. In his scholarship, he examines the ways that architecture engages such social constructs as class identity, cultural distinction, and regional differentiation. Fox is the author of The Country Houses of John F. Staub and the Houston Architectural Guide. He has contributed to Art and Activism, Projects of John and Dominique Desmenil, edited by Joseph Helfenstein and Lorene Shipsey. Gwathmey Siegel, Inspiration and Transformation. Rienzi, European Decorative Arts and Paintings. And Architectural Regionalism, collected writings on place, identity, modernity, and tradition. So please help me in welcoming Stephen Fox.
Well, thank you, Tam. And I want to extend thanks also to Charles Pivotal and Randy Tibbetts for inviting me to deliver this talk. I owe a special debt of gratitude to the Woodson Research Center of the Fondren Library at Rice University, where the Ruth Young McGonigle architectural papers are deposited, especially University Archivist Lee Pecht and Archivist Rebecca Russell and Nori Guthrie. I am indebted to Ruth McGonigle's children, Betty McGonigle Capshaw and George L. McGonigle, her granddaughters Anne McGonigle Kiefer and Courtney C. Capshaw, and her friends Mary C. Simmons, J. Calvin Walker, and Ellen Beasley for sharing their memories of Ruth McGonigle with me. Because I'm an architectural historian rather than an art historian, my interpretation of the career of Ruth McGonigle may seem somewhat skewed. Ruth Young McGonigle's career exemplifies a model of art practice that does not conform to the myth of the artist as isolated genius. It conforms instead to the alternate romantic myth of the artist as, and please excuse the gender bias, Renaissance man, a multi-talented producer capable of imagining and envisioning ideas, then translating them into material constructions. For Ruth McGonigle, whom you see here in the late 1940s, art was a practice through which she engaged the community in which she lived as an organizer of festivals, a scenic and graphic artist, an expert participant in civic decision-making, a teacher, and an architect, as well as a painter and watercolorist. Her career was associated with the South Texas borderland and spanned from the 1920s until the year of her death in 1984. What gives Ruth McGonigle's artistic production and that of her artist peers a certain poignancy is that it exhibits their fascination with and attraction to the Mexican culture of the borderland, a culture that most of them, nevertheless, treated with ambivalence in their daily lives and interactions. Ruth Gladys Young was born April 5, 1902 in Sour Lake, one of the coastal oil field settlements between Houston and Beaumont. She grew up in Houston and in 1920 entered the Rice Institute. According to her family, Ruth Young wanted to study art. At Rice, this could only be accomplished by studying architecture, which she did. In the image on the left from Rice's 1922 yearbook, you see her listed as a member of the Architectural Society. Its honorary members, John C. Tidden and Charles L. Brown, were her art instructors at Rice. At the lower right corner of the right image, you see Ruth Young as a graduate in the 1923 yearbook. She then stayed on an extra year at Rice to earn her Bachelor of Architecture degree in 1924. Rice University's current historian, Melissa Kane, called my attention to the fact that Ruth Young illustrated the 1923 yearbook, the Campanile. The Orientalist theme of Ruth Young's graphics slyly poked fun at current activities. Ruth Young worked for William Ward Watkin, professor of architecture and a practicing architect in Houston. According to her family, one of her tasks was to detail the inscription in the frieze of Watkin's design of the Museum of Fine Arts, its first phase completed in 1924. So she did this lettering. In September 1925, Ruth Young married her Rice classmate, George W. McGonigle, Jr. Born in 1899 in Flatonia, Texas, George McGonigle had moved to the South Texas border town of Brownsville with his parents in 1906. Ruth and George McGonigle became the parents of two children. You see all of the family in Ruth McGonigle's portraits here. George Lee, born in 1927, and Betty Jean, born 9 years later. Ruth McGonigle settled in Brownsville, a city founded in 1848 at the end of the U.S.-Mexico War, across the Rio Grande from the Mexican city of Matamoros, Tamaulipas. In January 1939, National Geographic magazine published an illustrated report on the lower Rio Grande Valley. Not until 1904 had the first railroad line connected the isolated Texas-Tamaulipas border with the rest of Texas. All of the Texan towns identified on this map were founded in 1904 or thereafter, with the exception of Brownsville, Port Isabel, and Hidalgo. George McGonigle's parents were part of the influx of Anglo-American newcomers who migrated to the Magic Valley to participate in the newly developed cash crop agricultural economy that steam-driven irrigation systems and railroad transportation made feasible. Across the Rio Grande from Brownsville lies Matamoros, founded in 1784. In this photograph by Robert Runyon from the second decade of the 20th century, one sees the Creole buildings that in the 1920s still framed Matamoros' central plaza, the Plaza Hidalgo, indicating the impact that builders and architects migrating from New Orleans between the 1820s and 1860s had on Matamoros' architecture. During the 1920s, valley towns experienced a construction boom. Romantic Spanish architectural iconography dominated the entrepreneurial Anglo-American imaginary, displacing and subordinating Mexican culture, which was nonetheless present but discounted because it lacked the picturesque allure of the modern Spanish style. Architecture was pressed into service in the 1920s to materialize this Anglo-American vision of the border as a romantic tropical paradise. This can be seen in the tower of the Church of the Advent of 1927 in Brownsville, the oldest Episcopal parish on the South Texas border, which had moved to the suburbs in 1927, and with which Ruth and George McGonigle were affiliated. Because Brownsville lies in the delta of the Rio Grande, its town site is laced with abandoned distributaries of the Rio Grande that are called resacas. Framed with subtropical planting, resaca-side real estate materialized the exotic tropical paradise myth. Nowhere more so than in Brownsville's most elite garden suburb neighborhood, Los Ebanos Estates, which opened along the axis of Palm Boulevard in 1927. During the second half of the 1930s, the architectural movement called regionalism, the architectural counterpart to the American scene, moderated the theatricality of 1920s Spanish-style architecture, as is evident in this house on Palm Boulevard of 1936, designed by a Miami architect. R. Newell Waters, the Valley's foremost architect of the 1920s and 30s, also embraced regionalism as can be seen in this pair of houses from 1939. The lower house, an example of one of the new regional types, the California Ranch House. This regionalist awareness was evident in the invention of Charro Days in Brownsville in 1937, a civic fiesta first celebrated in 1938. Charro Days was conceived as a pre-Lenten carnival in which Brownsville's Anglo-American elite, to the left, as pictured in National Geographic in 1939, are Charro Days founder J. Kenneth Faxon and his wife Bernadine, both from Illinois, and Brownsville's Mexican elite. To the right are Beatriz Champion and her brother Jose, dressed in the regional costumes of Mexico. Brownsvilleites participated in parades and street festivities in order to draw crowds to downtown Brownsville and stimulate retail trade during the Depression. The wives of Brownsville's businessmen took charge of producing Charro Days parades each year. Of the 24 members of the board of directors for the first 1938 fiesta, 8 were women, and of these 4, Calla Lily McGill and her twin sister, Clara Lily Ely, Thelma Rogers Buckley, and Bernice Worthington, were founders of the Brownsville Art League of 1935. Ruth McGonigle was also one of the 12 founders of the Brownsville Art League. Beginning in 1938, the League coordinated its annual juried exhibition of members' work with Charro Days. As early as 1940, the Brownsville Herald reported that Ruth McGonigle was producing decorative cachets to be stamped on mail going out of the Brownsville post office during Charro Days. In 1941, it was reported she had also designed windshield stickers to promote Charro Days. By 1949, when the Herald published a humorous account of George McGonigle rescuing the festivities that year by flying his own plane to San Antonio to buy glitter and fringe for decorating floats, after the sources of these materials in Brownsville had been exhausted, Ruth McGonigle was identified as coordinating the design of floats for Charro Days, working with Josephine Sobrino, chair of the Foreign Language Department at Texas Southmost College, and an expert on the vernacular cultures of Mexico, who devised the fiesta's theme each year. The earliest architectural commission by Ruth McGonigle that I am aware of is her remodeling in 1941 of a one-story brick Mexican Creole corner store building in Brownsville's West End neighborhood as a seasonal house, Mi Casita del Sur, for a widow, Johnny Powelson Griffin. Mrs. Griffin traveled in the circle of Frieda Lawrence von Richthofen, the widow of D.H. Lawrence, who began to spend winters in the coastal town of Port Isabel in the early 1940s. Mi Casita del Sur represented an unusually early reevaluation of the distinctive Matamoros-style Creole architecture of 19th century Brownsville. Mi Casita del Sur parallels the first house in Brownsville where regionalism was given a local focus, the neo-border brick-style house that Frank E. Torres designed in 1940 for Salome McAllen and William Scanlon, members of Brownsville's pre-1904 elite on Palm Boulevard. Torres was one of the first Mexican Americans to be licensed to practice architecture in Texas after the state adopted an architectural licensing law in 1938. Ruth McGonigle never sought to be licensed as an architect. This did not inhibit her practice of architecture, but it did mean that she could not represent herself as an architect. As late as 1950, she was identified in an article in the Brownsville Herald dealing with Charro Days, not as a building designer, but as a local artist. The extent of Ruth McGonigle's architectural career prior to the mid-1950s is obscure. In the late 1930s and early 40s, her name never appears in the newspaper in connection with new construction reports. The Herald noted in 1942 that she had completed painting the windows, apparently decorative scenes, of Brownsville's best-known restaurant, Landrum's, here, which had opened in 1938 downtown near the foot of Elizabeth Street in a two-story Creole building. In December 1950, the Brownsville Art League was given the mid-19th century William Neal House on condition that it be moved from its original site. Ruth McGonigle was charged with restoring the wood cottage, which was moved to a site next to the Rio Grande levee at what had been Fort Brown. Ruth McGonigle restored the three-room house, and she also added a spacious rear wing with a north-facing skylight to serve as the Art League studio. As was the case with artists in other American cities, Ruth McGonigle emerged as Brownsville's first historic preservation specialist. Among the papers preserved in the Ruth McGonigle collection at the Woodson Research Center is this vivid watercolor, which seems to show the elevation of three conjoined storefronts, including their display windows. Ruth McGonigle produced an undated set of drawings for a house that does not seem to have been built for the nurseryman Morris W. Clint, located on the Resaca on what was then the north edge of Brownsville. With its low-pitched hipped roof, exposed rafter tails, steel casement windows, and stone base course, the Clint House is an example of the California ranch house. This was the most popular suburban house type being built in Brownsville around 1950. Ruth McGonigle also designed a contemporary version of a California ranch house for Josephine Sobrino and her companion, Catherine Cherry. From the disposition of wings framing the angled entrance to the living room, you can tell that the house was designed to open to the prevailing southeast breeze, which would have blown from this direction. The low-pitched hipped roof, long banks of steel casement windows, and the stone-faced fireplace with attached outdoor barbecue pit, here the barbecue pit backing up to the fireplace in the living room, date the design to around 1950. Ruth McGonigle stands out as an architect who designed for same-sex couples, an unusual circumstance in a small town in which such domestic arrangements were sure to excite attention and comment. Ruth McGonigle's architectural designs were up to date without being far out. In the post-war period, an architect's acceptance, acquiescence to, or rejection of modern architecture became a critical ideological issue. Ruth McGonigle's position as an unlicensed architectural designer, rather than a real architect, marginalized her with respect to the all-male architectural profession in the Valley in the 1950s. Her ideological opposite was the architect John G. York, who came to the valley town of Harlingen, 25 miles north of Brownsville, in 1948. York and his partners in the firm of Koch, Bowman and York were the first architects in the lower Rio Grande Valley to regularly have their buildings published in the National Architectural Press, evident in this profile of the firm, which appeared in Progressive Architecture magazine in 1955. York and his partners were involved in the design of Harlingen's first garden suburban neighborhood, Laurel Park, where they designed many of the houses built in the earliest phase of development in 1950. John York's own house in Laurel Park of 1952 was radical, a flat-roofed, steel-framed house completely closed to the street, but completely open to its site and the prevailing breeze through walls of sliding glass doors. York exposed the steel pipe columns, steel bar joists, and steel ceiling decking, painting the columns and joists red so that they stood out. Van Glass, a female interior designer who operated Harlingen's Good Design Shop, Today's Living, worked with York on the interiors. In its radical assertiveness, the York House was the antithesis of the accommodating, self-effacing modesty of Ruth McGonigle's designs. Ruth McGonigle, however, engaged modern architecture on her own terms. In 1951, she, the San Antonio architect and historic preservation specialist Marvin Eichenroth, the Dallas architect Herbert Tatum, the Houston architect Staton Nunn, who had been a classmate of Mrs. McGonigle's at Rice, and Brownsville businessman Ignacio Garza Jr. were appointed by Mayor Herbert Stokely to a design jury to choose a winner for what would turn out to be the most important architectural competition held in Texas in the 1950s, for the city of Brownsville's multipurpose Fort Brown Memorial Center. The winning design by Wiltshire and Fisher of Dallas would also win a National Design Award from the American Institute of Architects in 1954, the year the Civic Center was completed at Fort Brown, adjacent to downtown Brownsville and Texas Southmost College. These were actually the old Fort Brown grounds with many of the historic buildings still intact. The design, and all the designs recognized with commendations, was modern, even though the architects on the design jury were conservative. The respect accorded Ruth McGonigle in Brownsville is evident from her inclusion as the only woman on the jury. Her affinity with Mayor Stokely, who would oversee preservation and restoration of another early 1850s house associated with Brownsville's founder, Charles Stillman, perhaps accounts for including a stipulation in the competition program that a location be designated for a commemorative mural or tile plaque, which was ultimately executed by Roy C. Keister, an artist from Chicago who was then the resident critic and teacher at the Brownsville Art League. Although it may seem exaggerated to invoke a work such as Diego Rivera's mural El Mercado de Tlatelolco of 1945 in the Palacio Nacional in Mexico City, the incorporation of commissioned works of modern art in modern buildings was a particular cultural preoccupation of the 1950s. In the 1950s, Brownsville even produced a second example of the integration of art and architecture, although at the opposite pole stylistically from the Civic Center, when Chauncey Stillman, a great-grandson of Brownsville's founder, Charles Stillman, commissioned the New York architect Joseph Sanford Shanley to design the Stillman Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament in one of the transepts of Immaculate Conception Cathedral, incorporating a painting of the Blessed Virgin Mary by the 17th century Spanish painter Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. Patronage of this sort, whether modern or traditional, was exceedingly rare in mid-20th century Brownsville. Yet Ruth McGonigle attracted patron-like clients, such as Hubert R. Hudson Jr., a Brownsville businessman and state senator, for whom she designed a luxurious guest house extension at his country estate, Casa Poinciana, outside Brownsville. Hubert Hudson was the principal donor for Ruth McGonigle's major institutional building complex in Brownsville, Episcopal Day School, which moved to the campus she designed for it in 1959. Her collection of drawings indicates that she envisioned a striking modern chapel, never constructed, as the architectural centerpiece of the campus. Ruth McGonigle's classroom buildings, constructed in phases as the school expanded year by year, are economical structures of painted concrete block, with flat roofs extending over external sidewalk corridors to shade buildings. Very much like the publicized and praised modern school complexes Koch, Bowman, and York produced. This is their San Isidro High School of 1950 in the tiny settlement of San Isidro, Texas. Yet even Ruth McGonigle's most economical buildings had moments of decorative exuberance, as at the masonry solar screen with which she proposed enclosing the school's mechanical plant. Ruth McGonigle's love of decorative exuberance is obvious in her elevation and plan drawings for a pedestal and fountain to be built in the school's entrance court. Ruth McGonigle's expanded architectural production in the 1950s seems related to a tragedy she and her family endured. In June 1954, George McGonigle was killed when the plane he was trying to land crashed on a Mexican Gulf beach. Perhaps for economic reasons, Ruth McGonigle became much more involved in architectural practice thereafter. In 1958, the year before the opening of Episcopal Day School, she completed a small church and parish complex for St. Paul's Episcopal Church. Constructed northeast of downtown Brownsville in Colonia Victoria, St. Paul's was the Spanish-speaking Episcopal Mission Church. It is a simple, modern building constructed of oversized adobe brick blocks with a wood truss roof structure. In the spirit of Brownsville's first Unitarian Church of 1951, whose elemental simplicity seemed to resonate with Ruth McGonigle. In the early 1960s, Ruth McGonigle produced alternative designs for the Parroquia de la Ascensión, the Anglican parish in Colonia San Fernando in Matamoros. The upper alternative was to be built with glue-laminated wood beams, the lower with a concrete structural frame. Why neither alternative was built is unknown. This is the vaulted concrete roof church dedicated in 1962, presumably the work of a Mexican architect. In September 1961, Herald reporter Mary Forrester published a feature profile of Ruth McGonigle describing her as an architect, thereby provoking a complaint to the newspaper from at least one Brownsville architect that McGonigle wasn't a real architect. The article mentioned her work at Landrum's restaurant on Elizabeth Street downtown, and her subsequent conversion of the Indalencio Treviño house in the West End as Landrum's new home when it moved to Levy Street in 1960. The article also cited the unusual house she designed in 1960 in Los Ebanos for another same-sex couple, the interior designer Alan E. Young and the restaurateur Earl Brown Jr., who owned Landrum's. Young and Brown occupied the house in Los Ebanos only briefly. Ruth McGonigle's drawing collection contains designs for a mixed-use, live-work complex labeled The Studio, on which she wrote Al and Earl. This was to be a walled brick patio house, similar in concept to Mi Casita del Sur, built on a corner lot on Levy Street in the West End. The introverted spaces of the studio, with the only windows facing into patios, and its urban street corner location, were utterly uncharacteristic of the freestanding suburban houses typical of contemporary housing in Brownsville. In 1963, 27 stained glass windows that Ruth McGonigle designed were installed in the Church of the Advent. George McGonigle had been a vestryman of the Church of the Advent. Their son, George L. McGonigle, a Houston corporate executive, would serve as provost and interim dean of the Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, and senior executive officer to the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church during the 1980s. Ruth McGonigle's most significant architectural work is the house she designed in Brownsville's Rio Viejo neighborhood for Mr. and Mrs. J. Kendall Hurt in 1963. The Hurt House pays homage to the 19th century Creole architecture of the border brick style. Rather than occupying a marginal position with respect to the work of other Valley architects, the Hurt House stands out as the first modern rendition of this historical regional type to be built in the Valley. Other architects subsequently demonstrated awareness of this modern regionalist trend, as in the patio-centered house that the Houston architect Kenneth E. Benson designed for his sister, Betty Benson Wynn, in McAllen in 1965. The parish hall and temporary church that Brownsville architects Gail D. Wilhite and his partner Lee B. Winans designed for St. Mary, Mother of the Church in 1970. And the buildings the Brownsville architects Swanson, Heister, Wilson, Boland designed in the late 1960s and early 70s on the campus of Texas Southmost College. In her quiet way, Ruth McGonigle anticipated the turn away from exposed steel and concrete construction to a modern architecture evocative of the regional historical traditions of the border. Ruth McGonigle did not design any new buildings at Texas Southmost College, but she did perform architectural remodeling on buildings there, such as alterations to the college's administration building, which this building, and also in the last photograph, constructed in 1869 as the post hospital at Fort Brown. By 1948, Ruth McGonigle was identified in the Herald as teaching art at the college. By the mid-1950s, she served on the college's advisory committee with other Brownsville civic and business leaders, participating in decisions about the institution's expansion, including new construction. Ruth McGonigle's major unbuilt project of the 1960s was a new gallery and studio building for the Brownsville Art League, designed in 1967. Her perspective drawing shows the 1- and 2-story building located next to the Neal House, with the recited Fort Brown bandstand to the left. The classical portico and entrance portal were to be reconstructed from architectural components salvaged from the demolished Fort Brown Post Chapel. The Art League's inability to raise funds for this building led to construction of a warehouse-like structure designed by another architect instead. I want to turn now to examples of Ruth McGonigle's paintings that her children and grandchildren own, compiled into a book by her granddaughter, Courtney C. Capshaw. Ruth McGonigle did not date her paintings, and Courtney Capshaw's book does not suggest a deliberate chronology. In 1938, Ruth McGonigle exhibited a painting entitled Like This Resaca at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston in its annual exhibition of the work of Southeast Texas artists. Her luminous landscapes, this is Bare Mesquite, focus on the paradoxical combination of tough, thorny, drought-tolerant vegetation and the lush green visible after a rainfall on the South Texas Monte. The sculptural profiles of the salt flats near the Laguna Madre and Spanish Dagger, and the juxtaposition of high-lit and shaded greens, sunlight reflected on the undersides of clouds, and the hot blue of the sky, produce vivid color sensations in Yucca and Boca Chica. During the years of the Second World War, the McGonigles were one of a number of Brownsville families who rented the grandiose Rab Stark house at Rancho Santo Tomas, 9 miles downriver from Brownsville. That image on the lower right is a painting that was found in the closet. It was actually a mural, but Betty McGonigle Capshaw did not believe it was the work of her mother. In the adjoining Sabal Palm Grove, the only natural palm forest in Texas, Ruth McGonigle painted a series of palm portraits that convey the various moods of this unusual site. Ruth McGonigle was also attracted to the shrimp boats and maritime settings visible at Port Isabel, in which she experimented with various techniques to capture the working life of Port Isabel and the Brownsville Ship Channel, the latter constructed in the 1930s, where I presume this painting, Work Barge, was made. Shrimp Boats at Dock captures the moodiness of the moist, overcast coastal sky, which you have only to step out and experience. While in Net Mending at Port Isabel, she uses shading to emphasize the diagonal profiles of humble coastal cottages and sheds. Watching from the dock employs impasto to suggest currents in the channel. Courtney Capshaw reproduces a series of still lifes that Ruth McGonigle painted. As with Egg with Refuse, these focus on ordinary objects that tested her skill in rendering shape, texture, reflectivity, color, and tonal gradation. This painting is titled Papayas, a fruit that people in Brownsville grow in their backyards. Saltbox with Vegetables strikes a domestic chord, while Fan with Tools suggests a male counterpart to the conventionally female subject matter of the other paintings. What I presume are Ruth McGonigle's later paintings, this is also titled Shrimp Boat, grow more abstract, perhaps reflecting the influence of the artists the Art League brought in to critique members as they worked. Churches is the only architecturally themed work in Courtney Capshaw's book. Like Shrimp Boat Abstract, it departs from the scenic conventions of the earlier work to explore shape, luminosity, and perhaps symbol in a non-naturalist vision. The paintings reproduced in Ruth Young McGonigle, her art, tend to be place-based, but as the hill in the background in Cemetery implies, they were not all based on landscapes of the flat lower Rio Grande Valley. Aspen Trees perhaps commemorates a fall vacation in Colorado or New Mexico. Note the verticality of the canvas, which subtly accentuates Ruth McGonigle's perception of the verticality of the landscape. In using the Newspaper Archive research site, I've also become aware of the existence of other artists in Brownsville and other South Texas communities who were peers of Ruth McGonigle's. Some, such as Antonio y Garcia of Corpus Christi, are well known. This is Garcia's fresco of the appearance of the Virgin of Guadalupe to Juan Diego, installed in Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Corpus Christi, designed in the regionalist manner by Richard S. Colley in 1942. Another Corpus Christi building that may have entailed an architect-artist collaboration is the Southern Minerals Company building of 1954 by the Fort Worth architect Wyatt C. Hedrick, with its flamboyant pastel terracotta exterior. Hedrick employed the artist, designer, musician Elizabeth Drain Bartell as his in-house decorative design consultant. Among the members of the Brownsville Art League, the most publicized was the League's first president, Clara Lily Ely. This is her painting, Wash Day on the Rio Grande. Two of the best-known artists who taught and critiqued the work of Art League members were Harry Anthony DeYoung of San Antonio, that's his painting on the upper left, and Paul Ninus, is it Ninus or Ninus? Anyone know? Of New Orleans. Frederick W. Becker, whose painting is on the upper left, was another of the Art League's artistic coaches, as was, during the 1960s and 70s, Bartolomé Mongrel Mestre, a Spanish immigrant to Mexico from Valencia, who settled in Matamoros, where he produced the humorous sculptural installation at Las Dos Repúblicas on the lower right. Two peers of Ruth McGonigle's from Harlingen played important roles as teachers and artists. One was Norma Alcott Knight. This is her mural, Development of the Rio Grande Valley of 1951, originally installed in Koch, Bowman & York's First National Bank building in Harlingen. The other was Eleanor Roth, seen here with the painting she did of a canyon in the Big Bend. Although valley artists of the 1930s through 60s tended to be predominantly female, Anglo-American, middle class, and often of Midwestern origin, there were exceptions, such as Humberto Narciso Cavazos, who was born at Tabasco, a ranch settlement in Hidalgo County, studied under Jose Arpa and Jose Gonzalez in San Antonio in the 1920s, and then at the Art Students League in New York in the early 1930s, before working at the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago in 1934. Cavazos returned to South Texas and painted the mural Alma Mater in 1938 at what is now the University of Texas Pan American in Edinburgh in exchange for tuition so he could get a teaching certificate. Cavazos then taught art in the public schools of Rio Grande City from 1946 until his retirement in 1976. Standing out among the generation of Valley artists who are the age of Ruth McGonigle's children is the artist and collector Anne Maddox Moore. Anne Moore still occupies the sensational modern house in McAllen that the architect Merle A. Simpson designed for her in 1959, in which the rigorous rationality of the architecture frames her effusive, exuberant collection. Modern abstraction was adapted to tile fabrication by the artist Shirley Marie Voikrot, who arrived in South Texas in 1958. Shirley Voikrot collaborated with the architect John York on such architectural installations as this mural at the Narro Sanchez Clinic in McAllen of 1958, and at the Harlingen National Bank building in Harlingen of 1959. In 1959, Shirley Voikrot and John York were married. Another artist of the generation of Ruth McGonigle's children was Oris Robertson of Brownsville, an actor as well as a painter. In the 1970s, Robertson moved to Mexico, where he worked until his death in 2006. Carmen Lomas Garza is of the generation of Ruth McGonigle's grandchildren. Lomas Garza's paintings, based on her memories of growing up in Kingsville in the 1950s, evoke a world parallel to that portrayed in Ruth McGonigle's work. Carmen Lomas Garza portrays the rituals and settings of small-town, working-class Mexican-American life in South Texas during the 1950s. These make one aware of the absence of acknowledgement of familiar social settings in published examples of Ruth McGonigle's paintings. Lomas Garza's work also makes one aware of the emphasis that Ruth McGonigle seemed to place on mastery of technique, and therefore her possible reluctance to produce work in the faux naive genre that gives Lomas Garza's paintings such emotional resonance. Americo Paredes, the journalist turned novelist turned folklorist and university professor, was born in Brownsville in 1915. His novel, George Washington Gomez, written in the 1930s and 40s while he was a reporter for the Brownsville Herald, is a witty, insightful, rueful reflection on the cultural dualities and socioeconomic asymmetries that prevailed in Brownsville, which Paredes cast in a historical perspective that seems missing from the awareness of his middle-class Anglo-American contemporaries. Paredes used his art to confront the otherness which he had to negotiate in daily life. It is not clear whether the members of the Brownsville Art League ever grasped or critically questioned otherness in their art, even as they were attracted to Mexican-American and Mexican themes. Today, the Austin artist Malou Flato perpetuates earlier artistic traditions in her tile paintings, installed here as a frieze above the immigration and customs checkpoint at the Gateway Bridge between Brownsville and Matamoros. It seems unlikely that Ruth McGonigle ever crossed paths with the pugnacious, outspoken, assertive youngster from Brooklyn who spent his teenage years in Brownsville in the 1960s. Yet in the last years of Ruth McGonigle's life, Julian Schnabel rocketed to international celebrity in the art world, drawing in part on his exposure to Texas-Mexican border culture and such media as tile and crockery. The Brownsville-born Mexican and U.S. contemporary artist, Ray Smith Iturria, in his collaborative work with G.T. Pelizzi, returns to the landscapes Ruth McGonigle painted in order to incorporate the soils, stalks, leaves, pebbles, and thorns of the South Texas borderland into his earth art constructions. Ruth McGonigle observed and recorded the landscapes, wildlife, and products of the Texas-Mexico borderland in her art. She mobilized her skills as an artist to visualize the possibility of basing the design of new buildings. This is a dated drawing from the year before her death on regional prototypes that she had been instrumental in identifying and preserving. Ruth McGonigle died on April 14, 1984, a week and a half after her 82nd birthday. Her self-effacing manner was not sufficient to suppress the memory of her contributions to the cultural life of Brownsville during the middle decades of the 20th century. Ruth McGonigle's identity as an artist did not relegate her to marginalization in her community. Rather, it facilitated her engagement in myriad ways that brought an artist's sensibility to everyday life on the Texas-Mexico border. Thank you.